I want to talk about an incredible technical detail that emerged from the first round of testing. The first detail that struck me and also struck other enthusiasts commenting on the videos is the management of front wing opening. As you know, Formula 1 in 2026, the new technical regulations, was concerned there could be an imbalance between electrical contribution and thermal unit contribution. Remember, the power division is 500 horsepower for one and for the other. The concern of those who wrote the regulations was that if the electric battery contribution suddenly failed, Formula 1 would find itself having to slow down. That's why it was decided to allow not only rear wing opening but also front wing opening on straights, without this depending on gaps between one car and another. And here comes the interesting part. There are those like Ferrari who decided to make the front wing and rear wing open non-simultaneously. I'll explain why this could be Ferrari's 2026 secret. Stay with me because what I'm about to explain is fascinating. As you know, Formula 1 in 2026 introduced a new technical regulation. The main concern was there could be an imbalance between electrical contribution and thermal unit contribution. Remember the division: 500 electric horsepower and 500 thermal horsepower from the combustion engine. The concern of those who wrote the regulations was this: if the electric battery contribution suddenly failed completely, Formula 1 would suddenly find itself with only 500 horsepower and would have to slow down drastically. To avoid this problem and maintain performance, it was decided to allow opening not only the rear wing, but also the front wing on straights. And here's an important difference from DRS in the past. This opening doesn't depend on gaps between one Formula 1 car and another. You don't need to be within 1 second of the car ahead. Everyone can open the wings on straights. This has determined an interpretation by various manufacturers on how to make this opening technique operational. There are those like Alpine who even decided to open the rear flap in reverse. Instead of tilting the last flap of the rear wing upward, it tilts it backward by sending it back. It's a completely different solution from others that shows creative interpretation of the regulations. There are those like Ferrari who decided to open both flaps on the front wing, the third and fourth flaps. There are those instead who open only one, like Mercedes, which opens the highest flap of the front wing. But there's an even more interesting thing that only Ferrari did. Ferrari decided to make the front wing and rear wing open non-simultaneously. Let me explain in more detail. If you observe Ferrari frontally when it opens the wings in full straight, you'll realize the rear wing opens first and an instant later the front wing opens. We ask ourselves why this solution that only Ferrari adopted. The reason could be very simple and is linked to the greater aerodynamic load present on the rear of the car. What happens on a Formula 1 car? We've always said that approximately 500 kilograms are generated by the front wing's work as downforce, as vertical thrust, and approximately 500 from the rear wing. In reality, the rear wing has vertical thrust that's greater than the front one. The distribution isn't 50-50, but more like 60-40. Hypothetically 600 kilograms at the rear, over 400 at the front. And what does this determine? If I open the rear wing first, I can manage the imbalance in terms of movement along the transverse axis optimally. I remove first the contribution from the more loaded wing, and only after that from the slightly less loaded front wing. Therefore, I'd have a more favorable imbalance between front and rear in the aerodynamic phase during straight-line travel. From an aerodynamic standpoint, I'd certainly have an imbalance linked to wing opening that's better. It's an advantage in aerodynamic terms that could translate to real lap time gains. To understand it optimally, you just need to think about opening the single front wing alone. What happens if I open the single front wing and leave the load on the rear? The car will inevitably sink on the rear suspension with a very marked loss in aerodynamic impact terms. And this will come into play in rain conditions, because there too they want to allow wing opening in case of rain always for reasons linked to energy recovery. However, they want to partially open this to avoid cars being left without vertical load in the presence of wet track conditions. What's determined by allowing opening of only one wing instead of two is an inevitable aerodynamic imbalance. Instead, by appropriately managing the opening in case of dry track, with rear wing opening before front wing, I can best manage the imbalance between rear and front suspension linked precisely to the different aerodynamic configuration of the car. So I could therefore derive an advantage precisely from opening the rear first and only after the front. This is only one interpretation. Other YouTubers like Nazca also make this kind of reasoning. But this curiosity has already been noticed by other enthusiasts too. I interpret it as an aerodynamic advantage. The fact remains that it will also be played on managing these front and rear wing openings strategically. To stay on curiosities, there's a nice photo where you can see from the rear Alpine's wing. Instead of tilting by lifting the front edge of the last flap, it sends it backward, obtaining the same effect but with opposite rotation movement. There are those instead who decide to open only one flap and make only that one mobile instead of making them both mobile. As you can see, there's a different way of interpreting this new technology. On Mercedes, you can see the movement of only one flap on the front. The fact remains that they try to optimize this opening. There are those who interpret like Ferrari also with non-simultaneous openings, and this could represent a reason for aerodynamic advantage. It was only a curiosity, but it's an aspect that emerged anyway and is worth pointing out. The logic behind this Ferrari choice is clear. By removing load first from the rear wing, which generates more downforce, and only after from the front wing, which generates less, you get a more favorable imbalance. The car remains more balanced during progressive opening instead of having abrupt imbalance by opening everything together simultaneously. So let's recap Ferrari SF-26's secret with non-simultaneous wing opening. The 2026 regulation allows front and rear wing opening on straights without traditional DRS to compensate for possible lack of electric battery contribution. Different teams interpret opening in different ways. Alpine tilts rear flap in reverse, sending it backward instead of up. Mercedes opens only upper flap of front wing. Ferrari opens both front flaps, third and fourth, but especially Ferrari is unique in opening non-simultaneously. First rear wing, then front wing. The reason is to better manage aerodynamic imbalance. Rear wing generates more load, approximately 600 kilograms versus 400 kilograms front. It's not 50-50 distribution, but 60-40. Opening first rear, which has more load, then front with less load, you get more favorable imbalance during straight travel. If you only opened front leaving rear load, the car would sink on rear suspension with marked aerodynamic loss. Managing progressive opening rear first front after, you better manage suspension imbalance and aerodynamic configuration. It's an interpretation that could give Ferrari aerodynamic advantage. Other teams open simultaneously or only partially. Curiosity noticed by enthusiasts and YouTubers worth pointing out because it could be SF-26 performance secret